Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi-Cantor Hilary Chorny.
Today's learning is real. It's real parsha learning. I didn't come here to give a drash on something else. I want us to dig into the parsha itself. And really just one word that stands out in the parsha. We're going to take a little journey through Rashi on that verse, and then we're going to take a journey skipping ahead through the Tanakh into Vayikra and into a Hasidic commentary on Vayikra. And the notion here is that we're making an in-depth exploration of a singular word that shows up and how it's used, and how, in particular, the medieval thinkers, moving on to the Hasidic thinkers, imagined this word being yielded and being wielded by our ancestor Yaakov. So we're located in the coming week's parsha, Bereshit. We're in Genesis 32, verse 5. And if you want to, you can join me on page 198, because that's right where we are at the beginning of the parsha. And Joel read for us a little while ago, Vayishlakh Yaakov malachim lefanav. Yaakov sent messengers ahead. El Esav achiv. He sent them to his brother Esau. Had these two seen each other in a while? No, it had been a minute, right? And it had been a minute on purpose because Yaakov had fled. Why had Yaakov fled? He kind of stole two things, right? But he stole the birthright, and after stealing the birthright from his from their weak-eyed father, he ran, and he went and he sent messengers ahead. And there's a lot of commentary and discussion about why he went and sent messengers ahead. We're not going to get into the why of that, but we are going to get into what he said. Artsas Seir Sidei Edom. So he says. He sent it to where Esav was, which was in the land of Seir, and that's in the country of Edom. And Edom is the name that eventually becomes associated with who? With Esav, right? So Esav eventually is perpetually associated with Edom. Vayitzav lemor. This is the verse that you'll find on your sheet, the second verse. Ko tomarun ladoni le'esav. Okay, so go and tell to the he says you should say to him. So he's instructing his servants, his shlichim, his emissaries, to go and say to him, ladoni le'esav, that is to my lord, to Esav. If I were going to break down a commentary, by the way, that's where I would break it down. La'adoni le'esav. The fact that la shows up twice, which means that ladoni was its own thought, to my lord, ladoni, to my sir. So there's a little bit of what kind of nuance, by the way, in that word, ladoni la'esav. Servitude, flattery when the person that you're trying to flatter isn't even there. I would say maybe a little bit of deference at that point, because when we say sir, that's usually a deferential. That's even true in today's parlance. Good. Okay. And then he says, here's what you should say to him and to his people. Ko amar avdecha Yaakov. Here, thus was what was said by your avdecha, your servant. But is there any difference between servant and slave in Hebrew? No. By the one who serves you, basically, your servant, and even the word slave is sort of buried in there. Okay, so avdecha Yaakov im Lavan garti, with Lavan. Who is Lavan? Their what? Uncle. Right? Okay. Im Lavan garti. And what is garti? It's the same in modern Hebrew. I lived, or I resided. And that is that is the very word we're going to dig into today. Va'echar ad ata. And I stayed back there, like achar, achrei. Okay. Va'echar ad ata. And what's ata with an ayin? Now, like until this very moment has that kind of a connotation. Okay, great. Now we're going to look at Rashi, and Rashi is probably a school of thought. It's like Shakespeare, right? Like it's a group of thinkers, but certainly he was an important thinker and writer. French. He was around in the 11th or 13th centuries. The later commentary we're going to look at is about 500 years after that. Full 500 years. So right now we're way back, 11th through 13th century. 11th, right? But He died in 1105, but his commentary may or may not have continued to be built. And so there are lots of thought. That's why people say, by the way, that's a great point. So what AJ was saying, by the way, welcome. Glad you're here. And it's nice to see you. And what we're saying is that he did die in 1105, but but his school of writings may or may not have been perpetuated from there. We have probably more writings than a single human being could have done, but who knows? Rashi was just a genius. So there you go. So here's Rashi's thought on this. He goes, Lo naseti sar v'chashuv, ella ger. So I did not become a sar. Where do we know the word sar from? We're about to hear that in another parsha coming up. Yosef and the sar mashkim. Right. We have the sar is I have not become an elevated member of some royal family. Okay. I've not become an elevated person in anyone's court. Right. Like, what's that? Or Sarah? Also Sarah, and also Sarah. So I've not become a Sar. I've not become a Chashuv. What is a Chashuv? I've not become of any importance. Okay, Lona Seiti. I didn't become a Sar. I didn't become a Chashuv, an important person. Ella Ger, rather a Ger. I became a Ger. So lots of different ways to translate this. I think that if you're giving fealty to the root, we probably would say in English a resident, and people sometimes add stranger to resident. So a resident stranger. Why? Because lagur is to live, and it just we have our different verbs, many different verbs for the notion of living. And this particular kind of living, whether you've got ger or garti, as we had in this verse, this is in verb form. You're talking about resident. So in the pasuk itself, Yaakov says to his servants, go tell my brother Garti, im Lavan Garti. I've been living with Lavan. Rashi says, no, he didn't just say I've been living with Lavan. He said, I have not become a sar. I've not become a chashuv. I've not become any of these important things. Ella ger. What does that mean? I've not become one of these things, sar v'chashuv, ella ger, before we read the rest of the line. So ger is often translated also as a stranger. Why is it translated as a stranger? Maybe Bob wants to answer that or offer something else. Right, I haven't become one of them. Why is it translated as a stranger? It's because it's like an unincorporated person. So stranger meaning I'm living in the land, but I am neither part of. He says, not only am I not an important person, not only am I not a prince or some sort of a member of the royal class, I was just like a visitor there. I was residing there as a visitor. Yeah? Someone else want to add something? Yeah, Marshall. I have no permanent status. I have no sense that I have any permanent status there. In fact, it puts me in a precarious position because perhaps I could even be booted from there at any time. It really should have, I want to say Rashi was missing a word here. It should really say thus in some way, right? And therefore, lachein is kind of missing in this place. So let's add in a bracketed lachein. And therefore, it's not worth your time. It's not valuable for you to hate me. Al birkat avicha. When it comes to, on the matter of the blessing of Avicha, what's interesting about Avicha, about your father? It's not Avinu. It's not our father. It's your father. Okay, listen to the levels and the layer. I was trying to combine the words. Levels and layers of deference in here. Avicha, right? Your father. Birkat Avicha she berchani, who blessed me, heve gevir le'achecha. These are the words of the blessing that Yaakov gave him when he received that birthright blessing. He says, it's not worthwhile, therefore, to hate me in regard to the blessing that your father blessed me with, barcheni, and that is this blessing that said, you shall be a gevir le'achecha. You should be a gevir is like another word for a sar and nasi, right? But some sort of a ruler or a master over your brother. What's he saying? Why shouldn't he hate him? Why should Esav not bother hating him over that blessing that he stole? Yeah, you have a thought, Irv? Irv says that the blessing didn't endow me with anything. There's no reason to hate him. Yeah, pretty slick. In other words, he's saying, look at me. Why hate me? Look, I'm a nobody.
I'm an ordinary guy.
I'm just a guy. I've not become any more. The blessing that you're so mad about, I've not become any better for. Yeah. Yeah, downplaying it. Yeah. Great question. So if he's a nobody, why does he have this whole, why does he have all this chattel, right? Why does he have all this stuff that belongs to him, the people who belong to him? Well, remember, is he saying this to Esau's face? He's rehearsing it, and he's sending it with his messengers, and he's not there, and neither are all the people and the stuff behind him. It's just the words that he's sending. He says, go ahead. You go ahead, my messengers. You go ahead and you tell him, no reason to hate me, says Rashi, right? No reason to hate me, because I'm just, Garti and Lavan. I've just been with Lavan. I didn't become anything special. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. No need to hate. Okay, I'm gonna finish the thought, but first AJ, and then I'll finish the Rashi. Okay, so yeah, right. So AJ says, listen, I've heard, maybe it's something that I've taken in, maybe it's something that someone said in a teaching, but I've always thought, Yaakov sort of grew up a little bit, matured a little bit, and became a little bit more of a trustworthy individual, bichlal overall, or maybe to his brother in particular. But here he is, and he's not being particularly honest about many things, including, he says, I'm right behind you, but then he's still in camps for a night. And I'll just remind us that in the verse itself, all he says is in Lavan Garti, which is true. I've been living with Lavan, right? And it's Rashi who's reading this sort of deceptive tone in. So let's finish the Rashi. He says, don't be mad at me. I didn't become anything important. And that blessing didn't really do anything, right? Because look at me. Shehare lo nitkaima vi. Because it hasn't been, in this particular nitkaima means it hasn't been established in me. It hasn't been actualized in me. Exactly. Thank you, Marshall. Yeah, it hasn't been established in me. Devar acher. What is devar acher? I have another thing to say, says Rashi. It may or may not be related to the first thing, but I have another interpretation. Garti begimatria taryag. The word garti has a value in gematria of 613, which is the number of the mitzvot, the commandments. Okay, great. And he says, Kilomar, im lavan garti v'taryag mitzvot, shamarti velo lamadti mimasav ha'ra'im. So he says two things. He says, I've been living with Lavan, and that the word garti is a hint at the notion that he's been living and learning how to live by the 613 mitzvot. And to clarify this, Rashi says, and I haven't learned Lavan's evil ways. Right? As if that's the thing that Esau is most concerned about in that moment, is that perhaps Yaakov got worse, wickeder, by living with Lavan. He says, no, I've been sitting and I've been learning mitzvot, which, by the way, kind of goes to your explanation or your question, AJ, which is like, well, like, what's he been doing all this time? Has he been getting better? Rashi says, in this moment, perhaps Garti is his claim that I have learned, and I've learned of my ways. We're going to take this in a completely different direction for this last bit of the teaching. We're almost through it, right? This is going to blaze by today. We're going to go to a completely different part of the Tanakh. We're going to fast forward to Vayikra. Go ahead and open up to Vayikra chapter 25. So you're going to find that on page, I believe, 680. What's that? 742. Thank you so much. 742. Great. So 741. Yeah. So we're at verse 23. It's at the bottom of the page, second to last verse on there. And this is in the mitzvot that we are being given in Vayikra about what we should do when we are observing the laws of Shnat Shabbaton, of the sabbatical year, which is very dear to my heart. Bless you. It's very dear to my heart because I'm about to take a part of a chalik Shnat Shabbaton, a sabbatical. This is my favorite parsha right now. And just thinking about it, how nice to rest. Nobody's going to be coming to do any landscaping or planting or asking me to bear any fruit. They're just going to ask me to be, which I appreciate, and I'm going to rest in that. So here we are in the middle of the resting time, and there's this command that we get, v'ha'aretz lo timacher litz mitut, ki li ha'aretz, Ki gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. So 2 thoughts and then an explanation as to why. So the land, it cannot be sold beyond what can be. What does it mean here? It cannot be sold beyond how in perpetuity. In other words, we have to be able to what? We have to be able to get it back. We have to be able to redeem it. Okay, so we're not allowed to do that because first of all, Kili haaretz, whose land is it? God says you got to be able to reclaim it because you're my people, and I'm reading into this now, but you're my people and it's my land, so you can't like sell it away from us. Okay, and he says ki, and the text says ki gerim v'toshavim, for, let's say, resident aliens or strangers or just visiting, not even green card status, right? Gerim v'toshavim, those are people who are actual resident, those who are residing within the land perhaps for even a longer amount of time. Atem imadi, you are but strangers resident with me. And what does that mean? In the context, what does it mean? It's not yours to sell, but isn't that phrase, gerim v'toshavim atem imadi, kind of weird? It implies that gerim v'toshavim imadi implies that you are strangers residing with me in my land, says God. It's a very harsh verse, actually, I think to a certain extent. And the Hasidim, the Hasidic movement did not want to read that verse in its pshat basic meaning. Right? We could dig into this for a long time, but basically, I'll kind of sum up the notion in the context. You have to hold on to this land, because whenever you are in land, even if you think this land is yours, even when I'm going to gift you this land is your inheritance, it is still an inheritance from me, and ger is still the status that you, my people, have when you are residing in my land. Chassidut, that notion, it is not the loving notion necessarily of God that they wanted to build a picture of, depending on where you were in Chassidut. And I brought this teaching from Degel Machane Ephraim, and it's on this verse. It is the first paragraph in Hebrew on the inside of the first page. And it's also in the English. I only translated the part that we are going to do, because otherwise it would have been a 14-page packet or something like that. But we're going to look at the Hebrew and at the English, and he's going to dig into this notion of gerim and also into the notion of imadi. Oh, Degel Machane Ephraim, he's a 18th century, he's Hasidic. It's not him, he's forgive me, Degel Machane Ephraim is the name of his work, but he is I'll come back to you right after Shabbat. The name is escaping my head. I meant to put it on here. But that's not his name. It's the name of the teaching, Degel Machane Ephraim. And he picks apart this verse with gerim v'toshavim atem imadi, and he's focusing on both the words ger and imadi. He says, yesh lomar bazev derech remez l'chavin zeh, that there's a way of saying that there's a hint in this verse, al pi sheshamati michacham, I heard this from a wise person, echad al pasuk ger anochi ba'aretz, al taster mimeni mitzvotecha, ki yadua, min ikot tevat ha'olam, ki mi shehu gar ein lo im mi lidavek will karev atzmo will sefer lo kol morotav v'chol libo. And I'll pause there for just a second. She'ein lo chaver is where we're going to go next. So he says, you are resident strangers with me, or gerim with me, means it's possible that you could talk about sort of an illusion that's taking place. I like that word as a translation, a remez, a hint, an illusion of about something. He said he heard this from a particular wise person regarding this particular teaching, that this notion of I'm a stranger in the land, do not hide your commandments from me. This is a verse from Psalms. He says it's known because this is the quality of the nature of the world, that what is a stranger? A stranger is a person without an without a people to hold tight to cleave to. And they don't have anyone who they are close to, or to tell all of what is going on to, or all of their heart to, because they have not found a friend, either Jew or Gentile. She'en lo chaver lo Yisrael v'lo goyim. Ach keshero'eh chavero hager, azai misaper. Hang on, I don't want to get lost in my translation. He says, when your stranger sees a friend, right? Misaper, he wants to explain to his friend, what do you want to do when you see a friend? Misaper, all of the what? When you see a friend, what do you want to do? You want to explain, you've been a stranger somewhere, you've been, everything that's going on in your life, right? He wants to say, he says when he sees his friend, finally, he says he wants to tell them, Bifnei chavero kol merotav v'yadua. And you should also know that it doesn't just mean that when you are a stranger in a land, this is the quality of the nature of the world. You need to first understand this piece about God. The quality of the nature of the world is that when you are a stranger in a strange land, you have no one to talk to. You have no one to tell the things of your heart to. You have no one to really unburden yourself with the happenings and with the things in your heart. But then when you see a friend, gosh, you want to tell them everything. Because their chavero doesn't just mean friend, it means a kinsman in this case. Okay? It means somebody who is from among your people. He says, and you should know via dua. This is my favorite part, and that's why I brought the teaching. Hakadosh Baruch Hu Kamo Ger. The Holy One, blessed be God, is also like a ger. Why is that the case? Why is God like a stranger in this world? Because God cannot give God's presence to anyone. God is also like a ger in this world. And we, by comparison, are infinitely small. We are even tinier. Our being ger is even tinier than that. So let me unpack the Holy One, blessed be God, also being a ger. In this verse, go back all the way to the verse on the first page. When God says, Atem imadi, what Degel Mechane Ephraim is reading into this notion of God also being a ger is that when you are like gerim in the land, it's not that I'm saying I'm God. This is my land and this land will never be yours and you can never sell it in perpetuity. He's saying, this translation is saying that God is saying, I am with you, the Jewish people, because my status too in this world is like a ger. I too do not have a place to reside in this world. How is that the case? That God is also a ger and not a chashuv and not a sar. How is God a ger, Sandra? Oh, I like that. Okay, so if we are gerim and we are made in God's image, then of course God is also a ger. Taibel?
Because God has no country either.
Because God has no country either. And remember that after the prophet Jonah, we have a notion that evolves among the Jewish people. It used to be, up until the prophet Jonah historically, that all of our great thinkers, all of our great Nevi'im, our prophets, said that God was at least stronger, if not only, located where? In Jerusalem, in our land, in our place. But after the time of Jonah, that notion is gone. And all across our sources, regardless of which sources you're looking at, late Nevi'im, all the way onward through the rabbinic tradition, we understand that God does not have a locus on this earth. So what is Degel Machane Ephraim drilling down on as a notion? How is God then a ger in this world? Sandra was right. What you're saying, Bob? So God has removed God's self. Right. God is no longer an active figure on this earth, does not have residence on this earth. Okay. If somebody was going to say something else. So God cannot even be reduced to having a locus on this earth, says AJ. It's not possible. God is infinite. It's too big to be contained in one single place, right? Am I understanding that correctly? And so it's understanding the grandiosity of God in that regard. Let me go down the way. So Gary and then Alan. That's beautiful. So Gary says, not everybody knows God. God is not a chashuv or a sar to all peoples on this earth. God doesn't have a special status everywhere. Right? There are plenty of people who don't. And in that case, God is a ger. God is a stranger to those people and in those places. That's really interesting. Alan, with which view of the rabbis? It seems inconsistent, this idea of God being a ger with which view? right? That God is the place of the world, that the world is sort of located in God. I think that could live in harmony, though, with the notion that God is a stranger wherever God is not known. That's possible, right? That there's a not knowingness in the status. And it's also possible that there is a loftier notion of what God is all over this world, and then also how God is received, or how we are received when we are in those places. It might be the case that the world is God's and the land is God's, but that's not how we behave in this world, really, not day to day. And I think that there might be a real differential there that you're pointing out, Alan, between this ideal notion that's being put forward and not. So I want to read this imadi back into our original verse, and the notion of ger back into our original verse. Remember that we weren't really talking about Shnat Shabbaton and this idea that the land doesn't belong to us, and even God. When God says imadi, what does God mean? God says, I am also a ger with you. So I want to read it all the way back into the original verse and this idea. We're going to take a Hasidic read on this first verse. So I'm bringing us back to Genesis chapter 32, verse 5. Yaakov says, tell my brother the following. Im Lavan Garti. I have been a ger. That's how I'm going to translate it. I have been a ger with Lavan this whole time. So instead of saying that my status as Yaakov is that I have been a stranger this entire time, I am nothing, this really goes with the second read of Rashi more than anything, which is this whole time I have been residing in this world like God resides in this world. Being a ger anywhere is an emulation of God's presence in this world. In other words, this notion of being alone, this notion of being not the people of the highest status, of chashuv status in the place where we are living, it's not only something that we can see in the text by looking at examples of our forefathers, like seeing what Yaakov's experience was, or what he claimed his experience was with Lavan. It's actually a godly experience. It is a godly experience in this world to be so small in comparison with the power that exists in any realm and in any place where we are. I think that went up. I was like, my voice sounds different to me. It is a way of being godly in this world. And how do we represent our godliness in this world? How do we live like God in these places? It's like the second part of what Rashi says, that living in that word of Garti is living in the mitzvot and embodying God's deeds on this planet. What I appreciate about this teaching right now, this is not about a drosh on the moment. I do think that there is a certain resonance to the notion of being a ger, being a stranger in whatever land we are living in. And we are living in a time when the idea of being a sar or a chashuv in our land as a Yehudi, as a Jew, is a very important differential than other places in the world. And to live holding on to, clinging on to this notion that it's not only the destiny of the Jewish people to live in this way, but also that there is a godliness embodied in that loneliness, that even God has no place to claim citizenship in this world, is, I think, intended in the Hasidic teaching to be a gentle, comforting blanket a little bit. Even God has nowhere where God actually lives in this world. So when you're feeling alone, and when you're feeling like a stranger, and when you're feeling like for whatever reason you need to say to somebody, I'm just still a stranger here. I'm just kind of living in this place. I don't have control here. I might be blessed. I might have been given the blessing, but look at me and look at how I'm living. That in those moments that we're able to say, but even God has no place where God lives on this earth. And in that we can find comfort and company in the highest possible order. So with that, I'll end the Shabbat teaching. I encourage you to dig into the end of the Digel Machane Ephraim as well, because it's a great teaching on, you can save it for Parshat Bahar, because we're going to get there eventually, and that's his teaching on Parshat Bahar.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.